The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
It is Friday, June 16th, 2017. My name is Sam Seder. This is the four-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live to tape steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. Folks, it's Casual Friday, but this one, not so casual. We are taking another technical day, but we have two great interviews for you. The first, Sabeel Rahman, author of Democracy Against Domination. He's an assistant professor of law at the Brooklyn Law School, a Schmidt Family Fellow at New America Foundation, a For Freedoms Fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. This book is a fascinating look at the lost legacy of a strain of progressivism that is far more relevant, or should be far more relevant today. And then, following Sabeel Rahman, Senator Al Franken, who I interviewed earlier this week as well. I guess this may have been actually last week. This interview went pretty well. It's weird. I don't like to interview politicians, but there's some that I make an exception for. Franken is one of them. Obviously, I worked with Al Franken at Air America. We were friendly. We didn't hang out together. We would often meet, frankly, in the bathroom. I was doing the morning show. I was doing the night show. He was doing the afternoon show. So we would run into each other, and we were working in the same place for 2 or 3 years. Then he went out to Minnesota to run, but he was always very supportive of me, and I contend that on the day that he was elected to the Senate, he became one of probably the top 4 or 5 most intelligent and knowledgeable senators. His depth of knowledge on the topics that the Senate talks about is impressive. And I would say the lack of depth of knowledge of a lot of senators also impressive. So he had it going for him in both ways. The interview is only about 20 minutes long. I thought it was going to be a little bit longer, but so I got, it wasn't as thought out as I had wanted. I wanted to press him on a couple of things, but and I didn't want to do the same interview I keep hearing over and over again about his book. So hopefully you'll enjoy it. But first, enjoy this interview with Sabeel Rahman. It is fascinating stuff, and very much, I think, where the left is headed if it's not already there. And then we will hear from Al Franken. We will be back live on Monday, assuming everybody decides to come back to work. I guess it's just up to them. Matt's off at some wedding in a state where marijuana is legal, so I don't know if he'll even come back.
Mile High City.
Honestly, I would. What would you say, Matt? Now, we're obviously recording this before you go. What would you say? Like, what's the odds that you don't come back?
About the odds that Trump would be our president.
Okay.
Before he won, actually.
All right, so you're saying...
Like 30%.
Okay. Fair enough.
I also like Denver.
There you go. Have you been to a state where marijuana has been legalized yet?
No, I have not.
Oh, man, this could be a problem. And Michael, I don't even know. He just decided, I'm going on vacation for 3 or 4 days. So I guess we'll see.
He had the fear of missing out.
Yeah. He was FOMO, but he's not going to Colorado. So it's Friday. I'm probably in the office finishing cleaning up. I probably have vacuumed now and rearranging things, and great. But you enjoy this, and have a great weekend. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program K. Sabeel Rahman. He is an assistant professor of law at Brooklyn Law School, a Schmidt Family Fellow at New America, and a Four Freedoms Fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, and author of Democracy Against Domination. Welcome to the program, Sabeel.
Sam, it's a pleasure to be on.
So I just want to note, and we'll put a pin in it and talk about it in a bit. But you were telling me before we started that you had actually gone to press with this in 2015, and the book came out in November of 2016. And I mentioned that up front, which is not something I normally do, but so much I think of the questions that arose, frankly, in the primary as well in the general election, about different perspectives on the state's role in the economy have come up here. And I would also argue, and we'll get there later, that from a political standpoint, purely political, this book would have also been helpful, I think, for folks running, particularly in the general election. But before we get there, let's define a little bit of what we're talking about. When you talk about managerialism or managerial liberalism, tell us what that is.
Yeah, absolutely, Sam. And I totally agree. There's so much that's happened since the book came out. I think there's a lot to flesh out. I'm glad we'll get a chance to do that. So, I think for me, I'll tell you a quick story. I mean, the book really got started as I was thinking about this convergence of events in 2008. Barack Obama's running for president. It's a huge story, of course, but then at the same time, the financial crisis is happening. And as the crisis went into the bailout and the crisis response, and Obama goes from candidate to president, watching the administration try to wrestle with that problem, that composed a kind of deeper question, I think, for liberals, and which is this question of managerial liberalism. So by that, what I mean is there's a common tendency, I think, maybe less so now since what's happened in the last few years, but for the last few decades, for liberals to have a certain way of thinking about how to do economic policy. And it basically boils down to two things. One is that the problem that economic policy is trying to solve is really a technical one of trying to make the economy grow faster and to work better. And then two, the way we do that is to really rely on the modern regulatory state, smart people insulated from politics, making sound public policy decisions. And so that way of thinking is what I think of as managerialism, and has a long pedigree going back to the New Deal and arguably before. But what I think the financial crisis and our ongoing debate about inequality has really cast into relief is that this idea of managerialism is not really up to the task of dealing with the really deep inequalities and really pervasive sense of disempowerment that so many of us feel in this 21st century.
And we should say you juxtapose that managerialism with the sort of I guess the free market libertarianism that at the same time, I mean, theoretically, right, they should have had that same crisis in 2008. Alan Greenspan, it seemed like he had it for about 15 minutes one day.
Right.
But that didn't really sort of sink in. And in your book, I think you are not, I don't want to say overly kind, but you are certainly kinder than I would be to that perspective. But lay out what that perspective is so that we can see, and it's almost as if these two impulses have been really the breadth of the debate for the large part of the past 70 years. I mean, there's not been a lot of room outside of sort of that laissez-faire perspective on how the state should act. But just sum that up for us so that we can get a sense of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, Sam, I think with the laissez-faire idea or the kind of market fundamentalism, whatever term you want to use, I think there the notion is this deep faith in markets as self-correcting institutions. So the idea is that, absent restraint and interference from the government, markets will check themselves and will advance social welfare and kind of address any problems that might arise in a complex and rapidly changing economy. I think what I emphasize in the book and historically is, which I think often gets overlooked, is that it's not just a blind faith in markets that drives this idea. It's also a deep distrust of government institutions on the other hand. So, if you can't trust government, what do you trust? You trust the market. Now, I think for many progressives, right, that's we don't buy that syllogism with good reason. But I think I point that out in the book and in the history, in part just to make the point that it's not enough to just say, well, the market by itself is problematic and government is good. We need to figure out a way to actually respond to this question of, well, what happens when government doesn't get it right, or when we have good reason not to trust government institutions. And so I think that juxtaposition is, I think, in part of the problem, where for so long we've been ping-ponging back and forth between free market ideas and a sort of doubling down on technocracy or on managerialism. And a big part of the book is to try to say, well, if we look at the history of progressive ideas, there's a much richer way of thinking about these questions in terms of democracy, in terms of power, and that can give us a better way forward. And
we should say, and I should say, that if people are looking for an example of that, of where that distrust has some obvious validity to progressives, even, would be in things like the revolving door, like or even you could also argue on some level, understaffing, right? I mean, there's horrible things that happen in the pharmaceutical, sector because the FDA just is not set up to deal with potential problems that may arise there. And we could go on, whether it's the SEC or these or the revolving door that involves our housing policy. I mean, on and on and on. And so
absolutely. And
go ahead.
I think that's totally right. And I think that the key thing that then separates a progressive response to those types of problems from the libertarian or let's say fair one is that a progressive response would then try to look for ways that we can democratize those government institutions, right? Because we still need them to deal with problems that are problems of private power, problems of inequality, problems of market failure. So it's not good enough to just say, well, there's a revolving door, so we're just going to deregulate. That's actually in a lot of ways worse, right? The progressive response would be to try to figure out how do we democratize, make more accountability, make better responsiveness in those government institutions in the first place, because they're critical to making a just economy.
All right, now I want to get into the practical implications of that term in a bit, but before we do, I mean, explain to us how you're using democracy here. I mean, it's obviously small d democracy, but make that a little bit more explicit, because obviously the title is Democracy Against Domination, but largely what you're talking about is, from a progressive standpoint, to be more conscious of power and power dynamics and the relationship between the people, the state, and I guess you could say the market forces, and how power flows between those three.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when we say democracy, we tend to just narrowly associate that with elections or public opinion or referenda. And those are ways that we can institutionalize democracy, but I'm using the term, I think, in a broader sense to mean the whole set of institutions, organizations, practices that we use to hold power to account. And so that could be public power, the power of the state, but it also could be private power, the power of too big to fail banks or monopolies or the market as a system as a whole. And that broader notion of democracy, that democracy is the way that we hold power to account, I think that has real roots in the history of progressive thought. So a lot of the book goes back before the New Deal, looking at the late 19th century and early 20th century, when progressives of that time are trying to wrestle with the upheavals of industrialization. And in a lot of ways, they were facing with clearer eyes some of what we're facing today in our current crisis of inequality. They're worried about inequality and poverty and that kind of stuff, but they saw those problems as being rooted in a deep disparity of power. That large corporations, new monopolies, J.P. Morgan, the financier before he was a corporation, when he was just a man, these folks sort of exerted undue control over everyone's destiny. And for progressives of that era, that seemed profoundly anti-democratic, right? That we could not be a self-governing people, self-governing communities, able to pursue our own fates if we were sort of under the subject to the whims of these private actors on the one hand, and then facing with a government system that wasn't responsive or wasn't able up to the task of dealing with the industrial economy on the other. And so for thinkers of that time, the idea of democracy became this much more capacious rallying cry. And a lot of the institutions of democracy we have now were really experiments, things that reformers of that period just were testing out to just throw at the wall and see what sticks. So everything from party primaries to direct election of senators to state and local ballot referenda, all of those procedures were developed in the progressive era as part of this broader attempt to create new tools for holding power to account.
I mean, it's interesting to me because the use of democracy in the context of your book is just not one that we use in the vernacular that much. It seems to me,
right?
Just because we get like sort of perilously close to, let's just go back to those days where there was only 400,000 people in the United States, and then we could all be in charge of everything. And it's again, I want to get to sort of the practical responses, but I want to go through because a lot of what you do is sort of track the development of these different ideas. And I should say that there's a lot of things that have come I guess have circled back around on us because this debate that you're talking about is similar to one that I think arguably like Jefferson and Hamilton had on some level, right?
Sure.
I mean,
we've been having this debate for a long time as a country.
And this concept, it also leads to a lot of like the antitrust stuff, as you mentioned, because it's simply a function of how do you, I mean, it really has to do with sort of liberty, but in some ways I feel like liberty has become has been hijacked as a word and really now when I hear it used in the public square, it really means just a way of giving corporations more power.
Right. Well, and it's funny because so much of this project ended up being an attempt at recovery of words that progressives sort of lost control over in the last few decades. Democracy is one of them, but I think freedom is another. For reformers 100 years ago, people like Brandeis, freedom included not just the freedom from arbitrary government interference, but also the freedom from private power. And so it wouldn't make any sense to say, well, liberty means corporations can do whatever they want absent of government regulation. That wouldn't make any sense at all. For freedom has to mean more than that. It has to include things like freedom from arbitrary control in the workplace, freedom to actually live the life you want to live without being constrained by scarcity of access to education or water or basic necessities of life. I mean, the idea of freedom that reformers were working with 100 years ago was much thicker than what we have now and had a much more of a progressive valence. And that's also part of what I'm trying to recover in the book.
Yeah, I want to talk about Brandeis and Dewey and in I guess, well, let's talk about Brandeis and Dewey now because they represent to you this forgive the term, third way of thinking. And it just strikes me, and I think it's a little bit surprising to me. And when you talk about Brandeis and Dewey, wrap this in that the New Deal, that the New Deal is seen as managerial in some respects. I mean, you talk about the freedom being reclaimed. You're the Four Freedoms Fellow, and one of them, at the very least, was freedom from want and freedom from fear, and the fear seems to be rather broad, and as does want there. But so talk about where Dewey and Brandeis were different than the New Deal.
Yeah, so I think there's it's a great thing to focus on because it's a piece we need to kind of distinguish a little bit. So there are a lot of connections, right, between the Deweyan and Brandeisian view and what happens in the New Deal. But I think the New Deal transforms some of it in important ways. So first with Dewey and Brandeis, I think both of them are working with this broader idea of freedom, where they're really trying to think about, given the realities of the industrial economy, how free are ordinary people really to live the kinds of lives they want to live? So the worker, without labor protections and without the ability to engage in collective action through a union, for Brandeis is not really free. And then for someone like Dewey, he's also concerned about the ways in which the market as a system as a whole constrains freedom, because it sort of creates a more diffuse set of restraints that are, it's harder to pin down because there's no single person causing it. But the inequalities of the market are very much a restraint on freedom. And for both Dewey and Brandeis, that diagnosis of what unfreedom really means in the world was really important, because that then motivated a big part of their arguments for why we would need a much more aggressive new form of government regulation, of unions, of civil society action as a way of making freedom real in the industrial economy. So then that's happening in the around the turn of the century. And then we fast forward to the New Deal, and at least in the beginning, the New Deal is really picking up a lot of the threads from these earlier debates in the progressive and populist era. And so, we tend to think of the New Deal sort of in these heroic terms, right? Like FDR and the 100 Days and all that kind of stuff. And there's something to that, but I think we risk forgetting a little bit how much all the stuff that the New Deal accomplished was really picking up on the spadework, the intellectual spadework, heavy lifting that had been done 20, 30 years prior. So the New Deal is a chance to put some of these ideas in practice. And, Brandeis was very influential especially on the early New Deal's approach to financial reform and securities regulation and stuff like that. But what changes as the New Deal goes forward is that the New Deal starts to take on more of this managerial technocratic vein. So, both Brandeis and Dewey saw democracy as a key part of achieving this thicker idea of freedom. It really mattered to both of them that the policies we develop to respond to economic inequality are in some way developed democratically, meaning that either through very responsive legislatures, Brandeis talks a lot about federalism from a progressive context, that's allowing people to participate at the local level, or it's through democracy in the sense of people being able to participate and pressure legislators and policymakers through unions and political associations and political action. That idea of democracy and participation, by the end of the New Deal, I would argue, becomes more or less replaced by the idea of technocratic regulation from the top down, that you have publicly interested, good faith policymakers who, now armed with social science and kind of new forms of data analysis and the new institutions of the state that the New Deal built, now these guys can go and sort of act in the public good. And it's not that, and at that point there wasn't necessarily the sense of skepticism about government action hadn't set in yet. We hadn't yet gotten to the Chicago School or neoliberal kind of reformation, right, or revolution of the 70s. But it is an important shift that by the time the New Deal ends, there is still this substantive commitment to a certain kind of economic inclusion, but the means have now changed to be a kind of more of a top-down rather than bottom-up means.
Okay.
And so that's the first step away from that earlier ideal.
All right, before we go to other steps, let me just so the problem with what happened at the end of the New Deal was less that the gun was fired, but more that the gun was loaded in some fashion. And to be clear on this distinction, we're talking about the difference between technocrats almost developing the goals based upon what is going to be best for society versus a political choice as made by our elected leaders or perhaps by other mechanisms as to where we want to get, and then letting the technocrats get there, right? I mean, is that
right.
what we're talking about?
So we're still, I mean, there's always going to be a need for expertise. It's a complex world, right? That's, I think that's always going to be there. But right, I think there's a difference between sort of there are two differences here. One is who's in the driver's seat. That's the difference you just mentioned. The other goes back to the idea of what is the goal we're trying to achieve. So part of what tends to get lost when you have a policy process that's more driven by technocrats, right, is that the moral goals drop out because they're harder to assess technically, right? You can't really measure in a numerical way economic freedom, but you can measure in a numerical way economic growth. And then growth becomes the thing that we start to optimize for and we start to lose sight of, what does growth mean relative to moral values of freedom or equality or inclusion, right?
And these don't necessarily even have to be moral.
Both of those things start to change.
I mean, we don't even have to use the language of moral values as much as just simply political ones, right? I mean, because this is also you can see. I mean, you can also see, I guess, this in. I mean, largely the antitrust. You want to call it reformation. That Bork introduced is exactly along these grounds and ends up being a cover in some way, it seems to me, for allowing these this power to amass in corporations, and that is that we measure. We apply antitrust values based upon efficiencies as opposed to just a political choice that we don't want big players to dominate in any sphere because there's a whole host of reasons that are both practical and just sort of theoretical. And we don't want those to exist. And instead, it gets sliced down to let's keep a different goal in mind, which is efficiencies. It's going to be cheaper for people.
Absolutely. Antitrust is such a great example of this whole trajectory that we're talking about, right? Because you go from the antitrusters like Brandeis who are definitely thinking in political terms, political and small d democratic terms about the dangers of unchecked private power. And then it starts to transform first into more of a technical process, which is trying to maximize consumer welfare and growth, but still doing it, actually enforcing the laws for a time. And then the laissez-faire sort of revival kicks in, and now suddenly you're not only have you lost the political values, but now you're also shifting away from government regulation to supposedly free markets that will take care of everything, and you've sort of gone back to an era of unchecked private power.
When we look at the response to the 2008 financial crisis, there was a big, and maybe I'm overstating it in terms of just how public it was, but I'm sure it was. You were pretty immersed in it. The fight between the idea of Dodd-Frank versus,
Yep.
which is using a scalpel in some ways, right?
Yep. Yep.
Versus, and this came out of the big document that the Occupy people, the Occupy committee that dealt with the financial crisis came out, where the response should be much larger and much more structural and statutory as opposed to regulatory. Can you talk about that? Because I think that also provides an illustration of this difference.
Yeah, so I totally agree. So Dodd-Frank, Sam, I think you're right, is a good example of sort of our 21st century version of this battle. So, post financial crisis, there was a moment where the problem seemed very clear. Right? You have this problem of too big to fail banks. So too big to fail becomes part of our vernacular, much like Brandeis's curse of bigness, and the kind of general response or public response to the problem of big finance really felt very similar to what things looked like 100 years ago. But then when Dodd-Frank is being debated, then you start to get into the nuts and bolts, right? And to simplify it, I think the fork in the road for the policy designers in Congress and then later in the agencies, the regulatory agencies, was along these same lines. Of, on the one hand, you have one option, which is to essentially double down on technocratic regulation from above. So, Ben Bernanke or Janet Yellen or the SEC, we trust them to, with better tools and more resources, to handle the problem. Right, that's one approach. The other approach, it would have been a more structural one that tried to limit the risk levels or the level of interconnectedness or systemic risk that posed by these financial firms in the first place. And so, to give one kind of very specific example, there was a big debate about something called the Volcker Rule, which was about a ban on proprietary trading. And when it was first proposed, it was proposed as more of a structural kind of rule to be written into the legislation. What ended up getting enacted, though, was the Volcker Rule was sort of made as a suggestion to the regulators to make up to figure out a plan on their own, after the bill had passed. And what you saw was what ends up happening is kind of a predictable series of events where then once the glare of legislation fades away, now the Volcker Rule is trying to be written in the regulatory agencies, and you have very sophisticated, very capable financial sector lobbyists, right, who are working really hard to water it down. And so you've lost that structural weapon in terms of reform. And that same story kind of plays out in a bunch of different respects in Dodd-Frank on too big to fail. There are some exceptions. I think in some ways the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is sort of the big exception to this, where I would argue that was more of a structural change because it changed the balance of power over who's able to regulate and hold accountable private actors.
I want to talk a little bit more about the CPFB in a moment, but we should also say that because these were regulatory guidelines, most of that was unwound. I mean, we just had Congress basically vote to unwind a lot of these things in Dodd-Frank. It hasn't gone to the Senate. It remains to be seen. But from a regulatory standpoint, many of these things can already be unwound, right? I mean, largely.
Well, yeah,
what the House did was more symbolic in some regards.
Yeah. So absolutely. So this is the real trade-off. I mean, I think especially in the later years of the Obama administration, I think progressives sort of got a little too enamored of policymaking by regulation in the sense that seeing it as an easy substitute for something more structural and legislative. The thing is, regulation might be easier to pull off than a bill in Congress, but it's also easier to unwind. And so even if the House bill repealing Dodd-Frank or dramatically dismantling it, if that goes nowhere in the Congress, that almost doesn't matter in that now you have regulators in the SEC, and we don't yet know what how the Fed is going to approach its duties. It's a little too early, but you know, it would be relatively straightforward for the regulators to dismantle many of the provisions of Dodd-Frank through regulation, absent congressional legislation.
I mean, so broadly speaking, when we're talking about, I mean, because there's two elements to this. There's the sort of there's the power, and then there's sort of the democracy element of it. I mean, at least in terms of like the way that the government's relationship with the state's relationship with the economy, it's the difference between saying like, okay, we have this tiger. It's going to live in the house with us, but we're going to put it, you know, in one instance, the sort of technocratic way is, well, what we're going to do is we're going to build a cage system. So the tiger can walk around, but it's going to be behind a cage, and it'll work out. Sometimes you'll run to the bathroom, but the cage system we've got is going to be okay. And then the other decision would be, we're just going to kill the tiger, and we're not going to have the tiger.
We're not going to take the risk.
We're not going to take the risk, and it's because we don't want the tiger in the house. And this is the difference, right? I mean, the technocrats are charged with protecting the family in the house, and so they come up with this system of gates and cages. But it's really a political decision that needs to be made. We're going to get the tiger out of the house.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's almost, you can almost think of it as a prophylactic or preventative type of approach, you know, in some ways, right? And this goes back to, you know, in 1912. In the presidential election of 1912, the big debate was essentially this. You had Teddy Roosevelt arguing, you know, taking the cage position, right, saying that we should respond to the problem of monopolies by regulating them, but leaving them in place because, you know, they're on net, in Roosevelt's view, they're on net good for the economy. And then you had Wilson and Brandeis arguing that, no, we shouldn't have these at all, right? We should break them up. We should have limits on the market concentration as a preventative measure to prevent these companies from accumulating a degree of economic power and then a degree of political influence that we won't be able to undo later.
And that's where also the I guess the sort of the liberty argument comes in on some level, right? Is that
right?
Once
Absolutely.
You have gotten the tiger out of the house and you said, okay, we're going to eliminate this danger, it's going to allow for more freedom of movement within the house. You're not going to have cages set up in certain areas because we've gotten rid of the tiger. I mean, this is,
absolutely,
I may be destroying
you know, I think
this metaphor. But.
right, but I mean, I think the freedom, the economic freedom that comes from limiting concentrated private power is that kind of is in a sense a kind of freedom of movement, right? And so, you know, for something like antitrust and even for something like finance, a big part of the argument, you know, historically and today is that by dislodging concentration of control in these sectors, one of the things you do is you actually make the economy more vibrant. You make it more dynamic. You make it easier for small businesses and different communities to borrow and to invest and to create. Right. So it's actually a way of unshackling the economy and freeing it from you know, a set of really more extractive relationships between where these concentrated giants are able to you know, extract huge returns for themselves, but at a cost to the larger society. So there's an economic freedom that comes out of it as well.
Let's talk about like sort of I want to overlay the last election cycle with sort of these ideas, because it seems to me that, I mean, and this is a little bit inelegant, but Bernie Sanders represented, and I don't know that he quite articulated it this way exactly, but he represented that notion of fighting power. And starting from that place, and Hillary Clinton represented a technocratic liberalism, and Donald Trump seemed to sort of represent. I mean, obviously he's a populist but a specific type of populism that favors power and also narrows, is anti-democratic in some respect. Insofar as it was like, well, we're going to be populist, but for a narrow subset of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I think, with the Trump election and just the politics of the last cycle, it brings up another set of issues which we haven't talked about as much until now, which is we have to overlay all of this in context of questions of race, of inclusion, and of who the people really are in the democracy. So I think of Trump's election as an example of a kind of exclusionary populism, right? It's a populism whose benefits are, on paper anyway, limited to just mostly white men, but they framed in various ways. But it's a very limited notion of who we, the people, are, and it's part of what's so terrifying about it, right? Is it's so explicitly and virulently exclusionary, right? But the other thing that's weird about the kind of Trump phenomenon is the alliance between that exclusionary notion of populism and the same old free market deregulation, playbook from the 70s and 80s on steroids, right? That's exactly what we're seeing with the attempt to gut the safety net and the Affordable Care Act and trying to repeal Dodd-Frank, as you mentioned. So what that suggests, right, is that I think there are two things that progressives have to sort of solve for at the same time. One is that so the first thing is that just realizing that doubling down on managerialism, technical competence, of the kind that the Clinton campaign tried to emphasize it's not going to work. It wouldn't have worked before, and it's definitely not going to work now.
It's not going to work on a policy level, or it's not going to work on a political level, because it's also a harder thing to sell because as much as Trump is anti-regulatory, and we had Bannon up there saying that in February we're going to attack the administrative functioning essentially of government. I mean, he did offer another solution, which is like, I'm going to be, more or less like a king, and I'm going to, beat up on a couple of people that you don't like this steel company or that, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think sort of at this point, managerialism is both bad policy and bad politics. I would say it's both. But I think the other thing that's key for progressives here is to think about how do we articulate a progressive populism that is multiracial, inclusive, and that actually takes head on some of these real sources of economic power that are at the root of why so many people are unable to live the kinds of lives they want to live, right? So, this part of this strand of progressive populism, I think it connects to Dewey and Brandeis and those folks, but you can also see it in some of the language and vision of the radical civil rights movements, whether it's in radical Reconstruction or in the civil and welfare rights movements of the 60s, of the late 60s. All of these different previous episodes shared this sense of foregrounding the problem of power, framing their aspirations in terms of a thicker idea of freedom and inclusion, and then connecting success to an attempt to build democratic power, that we're not going to be able to get these things done just by relying on sort of other people to do it for us, that we have to be able to exercise our own political power to rebalance the scales.
When you look across the landscape now, are there organizations, are there institutions that are, or for that matter, politicians who are pursuing and promoting that type of answer?
So I think there's a lot of richness in in the progressive ecosystem right now. And I mean, we're still waiting, of course, for a set of standard bearers to emerge. The next rounds of elections are a ways off. But so I'll mention a couple of things. One is that I think I see a lot of different progressive civil society groups and even elected officials starting to talk much more openly than they have in decades about the problem of economic power, the problem of monopoly, the problem of corporate power in general. And so it's not just the sort of Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders wing of the party, but you're starting to see this language come up in a bunch of places, which is great. The second thing that is on my radar is I think among the organizing community, progressive organizing community, I think there's a lot of just really fantastic work being done to try to do the on-the-ground heavy lifting of building a multiracial coalition around critiques of structural inequality and private power, and using that to try to build sort of the countervailing power of democratic action. And so you can see this in, for example, certainly in the movement for Black Lives and response to mass incarceration, and increasingly to the intersections of racial and economic inequality in, say, how cities do their zoning and economic development policies and things like that. You can even see it in campaigns like the net neutrality campaign. Like, I think it's often overlooked how much the initial success of net neutrality in 2015 came out of a coalition between new civil rights groups who saw it as a racial justice issue, alongside sort of 21st century anti-monopoly type arguments, who saw it as a private power problem, a monopoly problem.
Right.
So stuff like that, I think, is really powerful, and to me, those are indicators of where we can go as a progressive movement. But I don't want to oversell it in the sense that it's lots of people are working on this, but it will be challenging, and especially with so much coming at us every day. I think it can be hard to sort of keep our eye on the ball. But if we want to get out of this current moment in the long run, I think this is how we're going to have to do it, through a multiracial progressive populism. And if we can pull that off, then I think we actually come out of this much better off in the long run than where we were before.
Okay, Sabeel Rahman, the book is Democracy Against Domination. We will put a link to that and to your site at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Sam. Great to talk to you.
We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program Senator Al Franken, who apparently has written a new book entitled Al Franken, Giant of the Senate. Al, welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks, Sam. It's great to talk to you, of course.
Yes, it's been a while. I wanted to just start off by reminding you, and I don't know if you remember this, but you had me on the Al Franken show at one point while we were at Air America, and you told me that that I was going to be the future of Air America, and I just wanted to say, nailed it. You nailed it.
Okay.
I've been waiting I've been waiting a long time to catch you up on that.
Okay.
So I've been reading your book. I haven't finished it, but enjoying it immensely. It's really funny.
Oh, thank you.
And it's great. I've seen you on a couple of interviews now where you have proclaimed, or interviewers have said now, that you're being funny again, and it's true. You're being funny again in public. I presume you were still funny in private, but
yes, privately I was funny. I was allowed to do that.
And what has made the turn, A, and B? And this is sort of, I want to roll this question in. The book is really frank. It's a really frank book considering you're a senator. And how much?
Well, that's a low bar.
Well, it is. Go ahead. But speaking of low bars, is part of it? I mean, has Donald Trump, when you started writing this book, did did the existence of Donald Trump as a potential president and then ultimately a president basically convince you that the bar has been lowered, in fact, like, subterraneanly lowered and maybe like burnt and buried, and there's no bar anymore?
No, I actually started writing this long before, I think, or not long before Trump was anybody thought that he could be the president. This was in 2015 in August. So I don't think people were taking him entirely seriously. It just so happened that I had my wife and I were going to go on a vacation up in northern Minnesota for about 5-6 days, and she was in D.C. where our grandchildren are, and she got sick. And I was up there at this lodge and staying in this cabin, and I had threatened myself that I'd write about all this, and I didn't, I was alone there, and I didn't know if it was turn out like The Shining or whether I would enjoy it, and I actually really enjoyed it. And your question about when did this change for me was really about after I won re-election. The first election was very, very close, 312 votes. It was a very nasty campaign. I write about that. They put everything I'd ever done in comedy through this $15 million machine called the Dehumorizer, built with very sophisticated Israeli technology. It took took everything. If there was irony, they took it out. If there was hyperbole, they took it out. And that the husk that came out was deeply offensive in many cases.
Can understand.
And they just used that against me. And so I when I finally got in after this 8-month both recount and legal process, I decided just to be a workhorse to show the people of Minnesota I was serious. I had won by 312 votes. Needed to prove myself, I thought, and it worked. I mean, it worked in the sense that I got a lot of stuff done, and also that the people of Minnesota reelected me by a very comfortable margin. And then I said, okay, well, that I proved that I can do that and that I'm serious. So I thought I'd continue being a workhorse, but be one with a sense of humor. And so now it sort of freed me up to do all this.
I mean, has Trump in any way basically made you even more confident about not worrying about, I don't know, being funny and
yeah, well, things that they used against me that I had written somewhere as a joke in the context of either an SNL thing or a magazine article that seemed offensive in some way out of context, now compared to Trump, his own personal behavior were so mild and that was it actually, I kind of compare my campaign to his in the sense of like something's changed
right
in the last 8 years. And so that, the big thing that I think Trump being president has done is lowered the bar for being president in a sense, or devalued the presidency. And in other words, I think that, everyone is thinking like, well, oh, I see. This guy can legally be president.
Right. Well, I mean,
it
sort of shows why
the
attempt to say that Barack Obama is not experienced enough in this stuff seems, quaint in some respect. I mean, there's
a lot of things that seem quaint. Like, for example, that I wrote books called Lies and Lying Liars. You tell them a fair and balanced look at the right. And Rush Limbaugh was a big fat idiot, and other observations. And these books, a lot of them were just about proving that people on the right were lying. And that's just quaint now. I mean, just like the idea that even matters, and like, oh, that's adorable. He made a living writing books that pointed out that people in the right lie. And even his people will go like, well, you don't take them literally, take them seriously.
Right.
Remember? That's what they said during the campaign, and it was supposed to, that was supposed to have some significant weight in terms of, oh, I see. He's appealing to the anger, and we're not supposed to take him literally. We're supposed to be listening to what the undercurrent is, and that's a serious thought. But the guy what's funny about yesterday is that you have Comey, and then their response afterwards is, who are you going to believe, Comey or Donald Trump?
Or Paul Ryan basically saying like, look, he just didn't know. Like he just
he knew enough to get everybody else out of the room.
Right. That's right. All right. Well, let me ask you this. I mean, I want to turn towards sort of what happens now in the future. Is there a lesson, do you think? And we're recording this the day after Jeremy Corbyn's near win, and certainly in relative to expectations, and based upon the number of voters that he mobilized, I think can be really legitimately considered a win in many respects. Is there a lesson there for Democrats?
Well, I think that probably is a reaction to Brexit, might be a reaction to just to that kind of nationalistic xenophobia kind of, something that's been happening, a wave of that in both Europe and here. So but for Americans, we still have a long time between now and 18. And I think we should be focused right now on mobilizing against a health care bill that looks anything coming out of the Senate like the House bill looks, because it would hurt so many people. I'm chair of the Rural Health Caucus. I'm in rural Minnesota all the time, doing roundtables at hospitals, nursing homes, etc. And this would really, really hurt people.
23 million people are going to lose their health care. And I think it's actually, when you start to look at the whole system of waivers and what it could do actually for employer health care, I mean, because they're all going to run to that state, maybe it's Alabama, that has the lowest threshold for what actually constitutes health insurance. I think it's going to be worse than pre-Obamacare.
Yeah, there is the ability for a corporation that's incorporated in a lot of different states and provides health insurance to you in Minnesota to go to the kind of the lowest common denominator and get the worst policy that any state allows. So that is dangerous. These waivers, basically, I'm sure you've talked about this to your audience, but they're waivers on essential health benefits, which means that there are 10 basic essential health benefits, and now it's going to make it much, much harder in those states, especially, but if you're getting through your employer, to know what's in your insurance policy and to shop for insurance, because this, at least you had some basic protections under the Affordable Care Act, but now and what it's going to do is really completely undermine any protections for people with pre-existing conditions, because if you can waive pretty much anything, that means that people are very healthy can get a very cheap policy that doesn't cover much and just hope nothing bad happens to them that year, or they can get catastrophic and almost nothing else. And that means people, for example, with addiction, who've been treated for addiction or mental illness, will be priced out of any policy that policies that don't cover that will be cheaper. And so it just erases all protections for people with pre-existing conditions.
What?
So Yeah.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, because I think I've beaten these numbers into our audience to death at this point on some level. But what
I'll bet you have.
Yes, it's been rather, I think, punishing for people.
That's why you were the future of America.
There you go. Exactly.
You cared about numbers.
But what are Dems? I mean, are Democrats are not? Is there? I mean, there seems to have been. I mean, a lot of this stuff is getting crowded out because of the Comey stuff and in Russia, at least in the context of the news media. And I can understand why they do that. I mean, obviously, it's a ratings boon for people, and it's obviously important in and of itself. But you make the point that we're on the verge of tens of millions of Americans losing their health insurance, and children, and so what are Democrats doing? And what more can they do, do you think, to remobilize people?
Well, you got to be in contact with your senators, go to their town meetings, the Republican senators. I don't know.
They're not having any.
What their progress is on this. They're meeting behind closed doors, 13 Republicans, 13 male Republicans that McConnell chose. This is the wrong way to do this. We just got to be yelling, and we got to be organizing, and that means we have to do demonstrations, and we have to let these Republicans know, especially those who are coming up in 18, and those are going to come up in 20, that this is something that you won't stand for.
Is there? I mean, what do you think Democrats should be? In the event that they do pass this, which I think, there's some skepticism as to whether or not they will pass it out of the Senate, and there's some skepticism that they could come out of conference. But I think the golden chalice for these guys is tax cuts, and in the event that they do, what do Democrats offer? I mean, have you signed on? Are you contemplating signing on to the Medicare for All bill that I know, I guess Sanders is about to introduce and Gillibrand is going to co-sponsor?
I mean, sure. It's the question is, I write about healthcare in the book, and I talk about where we were in 2009, and pointed out that there were some of us who were for single payer, but you have to get 60 votes, and we were about 50 votes short.
Right.
And so, I don't think there's a Republican who is a single payer person, and there are probably some Democrats who aren't. So realistically, I mean, what I've been trying to do, one is I have a very comprehensive bill on prescription drugs. We pay a lot more for prescription drugs than any other country, and we produce about half of them. And we pay for them several times. We pay for them in NIH, which does a lot of the basic research that leads to these things, these pharmaceuticals. We give them a tax break they can expense their advertising. No other country in the world does that except us. One other, New Zealand, for some reason.
It's tough to reach people there.
I'm sorry, what?
Tough to reach people there. They're very spread out, I think, and sparse in New Zealand.
Okay. I don't know New Zealand well enough. I know they have lamb and they have dairy,
right.
And it's beautiful. It's a beautiful place. But and they're the only other country in the world that allows pharmaceutical companies to deduct their marketing, and they spend more money on marketing than on research. And so that's part of my bill. But there's all kinds of ways we can allow Medicare to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies. In Medicare Part D, every other country does that. The reimportation, so you can get drugs from Canada and make sure there's a secure chain of custody, so that you're getting safe drugs, but they pay a lot less in other countries. Why not why should Americans pay for this so many times? And so that's something that your listeners, I know, are experiencing. The spike in pharmaceuticals in the last 3 years. But then we should also be paying attention. We should be addressing what's been happening in the exchanges, which the Republicans have deliberately undercut. We should have a public option. We need a public option. And a public option would say that any county in the United States, you can sign on to some kind of public option, probably through your state or through Medicaid or something.
But I'm saying, if in the event that they do actually pass this, what amounts to the replace and repeal, do the Democrats, because I'm wondering, like in 2018, is there a national message for the Democrats? Obviously, curtailing Trump is going to be a primary one, but is there a positive, sort of like, this is what we're going to deliver, elevator pitch?
Yeah, absolutely. We Democrats. I write in the book why I'm a Democrat. Yeah, that's my first chapter essentially, and that's why I write about how I grew up and how my wife grew up. I grew up. My dad didn't graduate high school. We had a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house that the 4 of us lived in. But I consider myself the luckiest kid in the world because I'm older than you. I was growing up middle class, at the height of the middle class in the 50s in America, in Minnesota, in St. Louis Park, and I felt like I could do anything. And I don't think people feel that way anymore. I think that's what a lot of the anger is. When freshman year of college, I meet my wife. She didn't grow up as lucky as I did. Her father died when she was 18 months old. A World War II decorated veteran, died in a car crash. 5 kids. Mom's 29 with 5. The youngest one's 3 months old. And but they make it because of Social Security survivor benefits, and they make it because the girls get to go to college on Pell Grants and scholarships, and that in those days a full Pell Grant paid for 80% of a public college education.
Right.
Today it's like 35%. They made it because of the GI Bill. My mother-in-law, when the youngest went to high school, she got a $300 GI Bill loan and went to college herself. And she did that 4 times and became a elementary school teacher. And she had her loans forgiven because she taught poor kids. She taught under Title I. So my brother went in the Coast Guard. Everyone became a productive member of the middle class. And they tell you in this country, you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We all believe that, but first you have to have the boots, and the government gave them the boots. So that's what Democrats are about. And if you look at what Donald Trump is doing in terms of just his health care bill, you have a $880 billion cut in Medicaid, a $900 billion tax cut for those at the top. They are not for us.
Right.
We will deliver the message about what we are for. And we're for bringing the price of pharmaceuticals down. We are for shoring up the marketplace in insurance. We are for protecting people with pre-existing conditions. We are for everyone getting health care. We are for making college more affordable. We are for workforce development. We are for an economy that grows from the middle out. That's what we believe, not from the top down.
I wanted to just touch base.
I guess I'm supposed to be getting going soon, so we got to wrap it up somewhat soon.
I wanted to just, because the in the Gorsuch hearings, I thought that you in particular, but your colleagues as well, in going after Gorsuch for his rulings with the little guy versus the big guy, how much of like the antitrust stuff do you think we're going to see going forward in Democratic politics? Because there seems to be a growing movement that is talking about monopolies and antitrust, and you see things like Sinclair Media concentrating, which I know has been a big issue for you. I mean, where do you see that in the future of Democratic politics?
Well, this is my critique of the court that started in my fifth day in the Senate, when the Sotomayor hearings, when I talked about this. Roberts Court has been an activist, pro-corporate court, an activist conservative court, and that's what I tried to develop during the Gorsuch hearings, and that's a very major issue in this country, is such a pro-corporate Supreme Court. And unfortunately, I thought we were going to get, when Hillary would win, we would get either Merrick Garland, or I think she would have just gone with Garland. But, we could have gotten rid of Citizens United. That was a 5-4 vote. There's so many 5-4 votes. And that is about dark money, and that's about the Koch brothers. It's about the corporate influence, and they have kind of captured the courts. And they're trying to capture the regulatory agencies. You see EPA getting rid of their scientific advisory boards and replacing them with pro-industry people, the scientists, supposedly, I think. And this is, it's a big fight. It's a constant fight. And your listeners need to be a part of it.
All right. Well, Senator Franken, are you going to run for president?
No.
Oh.
That's not something I'm going to do.
Okay. I figured if I asked it really quick, maybe I'd catch you off guard with it.
That was a good strategy.
Who knows? But Senator Franken, thank you so much for coming
Sam,
on
good
today.
to talk to you.